to transform the relationship between the government and the charity sector. We have seen data transform so many industries, and the civic sector is coming back. But we also have great hopes for the civic center, because that's where we conduct our advocacy. This is where we shape who we are and how we want to relate to each other. And so the impact of data brings up fundamental issues about the ethics of our common space and how we relate to each other as well. We have seen that there are certain implicit biases that are sometimes built into algorithms and the systems that we use to arrange the work that we do. And we certainly expect the civic space to correct for those some of those issues, if not to solve all of them by itself. So I'm very pleased that this collaboration is taking place, especially hosted at a university, because I think our universities will play an important role, and ICADIA is showing some forward-looking vision in terms of hosting this important conversation. So let me invite Senators Deakin and Senators Omidyvar to share their views in terms of what they think the top concerns are in this space as we open up this important conversation.
Thank you. I'd love Senator Omidyvar to begin, because she led the development of a report in the Senate of Canada focused just on the challenges facing the charitable sector. And I think it's important to embed the conversation in that reality. And so I'd really very much like to start with her sharing her expertise, if that's acceptable to you, Senator Omidyvar.
Of course it is. Thank you, Colin, and thank you, Dean Pasek, for inviting me to be part of this really important conversation. So I'm going to correct you, Dean Pasek. In Canada, we too are obsessed with regulating charities through taxation as opposed to any other aspects of it. And we've had no discussion at the government level at all about AI, digital platforms, philanthropy. But I think it is, as you say, encouraging to see a university start this conversation. And typically, universities engage in these types of conversations. A couple of research papers are written, and then comes some kind of action. And so I know that Senator Deakin and I are absolutely thrilled that we are at hopefully the start of a conversation about what government should, must, and must not do. So when we did the Senate Charity Study in 2018, we heard from over 200 witnesses. We got more than 700 stakeholders completing a survey for us. We heard from academics, practitioners, philanthropists, lawyers, tax officials. And I actually went through the report. It was the first ever deep dive on charities done by the Senate. And in fact, the word artificial intelligence did not come up. There were some conversations about digital capacity, but it was not in the mainstream of the conversation. And I must conclude that the sector itself is not that engaged with AI and digital platforms as it must be. So, let me put my own bias out on the table. AI is one part of the future of philanthropy. And we know from the COVID crisis that charities and not-for-profits have already had to pivot to providing services to clients on platforms. They need to, if they haven't already, switch to artificial intelligence as a way of engaging donors. And I think we all know, this audience will know, that donor engagement is the key to donor loyalty. And artificial intelligence makes donor engagement all that much easier. All this at a time when the sector is seriously challenged in raising money, because the trend in the number of donors is trending downwards, not upwards. The trend is that many people, especially young people, choose causes over institutions, therefore challenging, the gold standard of fundraising, which is monthly donations. So these kids may well give happily to a crowdfunding campaign to support a journalist in Sudan. I'm not sure if they're ready then to take the next steep step and donate to the United Nations or something like this. So, but so in spite of, we have to embrace digitization and artificial intelligence in philanthropy. There's no looking back, but there are certain questions and concerns. And first is the issue of equity. Which sectors, which organizations will have the capacity to embrace technology, and who will be left behind? In Canada, we know already that hospitals, museums, universities have already embraced artificial intelligence. Um, but what about, I wonder about the smaller charities, on the ground charities who are dealing with issues of inequality, equity, and racial justice? I doubt they have the capacity to, without help, to reach out to this new platform. And when we did the study in the Senate, we discovered that the HR capacity in the sector is remarkably shallow, even though it employs 2.5 million people. It doesn't have HR departments, let alone, succession plans or anything like that. Uh, in the United States, I've noticed some forward looking charities appointing chief data officers. Now, in an ideal world, that should be something that charities should be considering, just as they have, a chief accountant. They should have a chief data officer to look at the capacity, to look at guardrails. But I know that's not within our reach. Maybe, though, this is a collective effort for the sector. For me, the most worrisome thing about AI, not yet resolved to me, is the issue of ownership. Who owns artificial intelligence? Who owns the information collected by these various platforms? At this point, charities, as far as I know, are mostly customers of AI platforms. And the data belongs to the platform, not to the charity. And I'm not suggesting that charities develop their own platforms. That's not what their mission is about. But I do think models of co-ownership and partnership where responsibility, accountability are shared are preferable to the customer platform that is currently used. And frankly, the AI platforms are outstripping the capacity of traditional platforms like the United Way. And I would say that there is a risk of of digitization would drive more donors towards deinstitutionalization, which means people giving directly to causes as opposed to giving, to an institution. We have suggested that the government create a home in the government for the charitable and not-for-profit sector, which is not the regulator, not the CRA, but a home in government, in a ministry, in a department that has a capacity to link the various interests and capacities of the sector, horizontally and vertically. If this happens, and I'm certainly working really hard to make sure that this recommendation is delivered on, then this would be a place for the government to take a look at AI, take a look at the guardrails that need to be put up, take a look at capacity building, take a look at ethics, because ethics is big, as Dean Passig said. AI is not pure, it's not agnostic, it has inbuilt biases. So I think this conversation, if it hopefully leads us to answering some questions, and I'll just pose them. The first question would be, how are we mitigating bias? The next one would be, what are we doing about equity? What about ethical guidelines? Who do we partner or work with? And what value do we bring? If we frame the conversation in that way, perhaps we will start lapping at some of the answers that are available to us. Thank you. I hope that was not too much.
Well, I think this is amazing, and I wish we could have some of your wisdom to talk to some of the people who regulate our sector south of the border. But let me turn to Senator Deakin and get his perspective.
What a great place to start. And the thoughtful perspective that Senator Omidyar puts forward, to me, is foundational to this conversation, without a doubt. One of the challenges, though, I think, is that despite those questions, our charities have to move forward. They've got to find a way forward on this issue. So there's a lack of expertise in the organizations. There's a lack of experience, and there is I think, justifiable concern about whether or not the tools can be trusted and applied appropriately to really serve the target of that charity, the target group of that charity. And so those are questions that I think absolutely have to be addressed. But equally, coming up behind is this digital disruption that is fundamentally going to to challenge the utter existence of many charities, and is already. And that to me is the concern that I have, because the need that they're serving has not been abated. But their ability as an organization to manage the disruption that's going on in terms of how Canadians and how Americans are engaging, the evidence is that we have digitized at a rate during COVID of about a year per month. The inflection point that COVID caused in the rate at which society is digitized, and the fact that conferences like this are happening online now, which is fantastic. It's reducing our carbon footprint and our costs and increasing our accessibility and allowing us to in 3 different cities to have a conversation about a very important topic. All of that is happening with a whole lot of good attached to it, but there's roadkill that's happening. There are organizations that are not able to keep up, and that for me is we can't avoid that reality. So I look at the cost savings that can occur in a charity. I still get very frustrated when a charity that I've given to digitally is communicating with me via mail and other more expensive means, where they do not actually engage with me. They're selling me. And that's a different relationship. When I feel like I'm receiving something in the mail and being asked to donate, it's a sales pitch, purely. It is not an engagement about what am I interested in, why was I there, what are the, and where they are offering to me the value they delivered with my last donation. This is how I'm showing my accountability. It's a very different relationship that I have online with a charity than I do in a traditional charity. And the cost savings can be phenomenal, and the reach and the ability to demonstrate the impact of an individual's donation is hugely valuable and inspiring increased engagement. So with all of the challenges that Senator Omidyvar absolutely put forward, I'm in agreement with all of them. All of them, I think, are manageable with attention. In Canada, we have our accredited digital standards body is called the CIO Strategy Council. And they've come up with an ethical AI standard. It will evolve over time. But the point is, organizations, it just speaks to the fact that organizations need to be thoughtful about the biases within their data and the biases within the process that they're managing those data. That is similar to being thoughtful about another point that Senator Omidyvar regularly raises, which is, how is your board of directors reflecting the communities that you're serving? That your governance structure decides an awful lot of things that happen inside your organization, as your algorithm will decide a lot of your engagement. So it's a similar thoughtful approach that needs to be taken. And those who lead that thoughtful conversation and being explicit in their decision making around it and how they validate it, I think will prove to be the leaders. So I'll stop there as an introductory comment, but I'm really I'm excited by this conversation.
Well, allow me to react to your wonderfully insightful comments. I mean, I think first, Senator Omidyvar talked about some of the overall contextual issues. We see some of the same issues in the United States, the generational changes, the deinstitutionalization, and the migration into proprietary online platforms. So we do research and that mirrors what's happening in Canada to show that the number of households who are donating is going down, which is a major, which is a big change, because we used to say that more Americans gave than voted, which was, a sense that philanthropy was part of the civic life, and that's very important for us, and that's going down. So that's that's concerning for us. And there's a generosity commission that we've put together to think about the bigger implications of that. And that reflects a commission that was created 50 years ago, the Filer Commission, one of whose recommendations was to create a cabinet level position in the United States that would oversee and partner with the charitable sector. And so that you don't have only the tax authorities overlooking kind of the compliance issues, which are important, but they're not the full story, nor the wonderfully broad landscape that Senator Omidyvar mentioned as well. We have done some research on crowdfunding because we know that the transactional migration that Senator Deakin talked about, the fact that the digitization of transactions is happening very rapidly, and the question is who owns it, and increasingly it's being owned by commercial entities who are not thinking as collaboratively as they should in terms of what does that data reflect about the communities who are being served. How do we engage, as the senator said, the communities in deciding how this data can serve them so that these things aren't being imposed upon them? And how do you engage communities in those conversations? I think those are really important conversations. And we see that people are very positively disposed toward these platforms that can aggregate lots of donations. But we don't have much for policymaking. We don't have much in the United States, much insight into what's going on there. We have to kind of cajole those platforms to share their data because we don't have the same mechanisms to even find out what is happening on those platforms as well. But I think operationally also, I think one of the key issues is that the relationships are so important in our world. And I think the United Ways are trying to figure out what roles they will have in this place. And during the pandemic, when the inequities in our society in all of our societies became even more apparent, the United Ways and the community foundations, both important community-based movements that are shared between the United States and Canada, played a major role in consolidating and bringing together special COVID funds at the same time and really engaging their communities during the emergency that we all shared. But the question is, how do we move forward and how do we make sure that all the data that is being generated is going to be beneficial? And so I think the notion of standards, the notion of creating collaborations, the notion of making governments and nonprofits aware about the importance of data. Often we starve our nonprofits because we think of everything that has to do with the capacity of the nonprofits as being overhead, as being expense. But in what industry do you not invest in the talent? And you have to invest in talent and the systems that we often do not invest in the nonprofit sector because we think it's overhead and we want to rush out all of the money into the program. So that is an important managerial leadership issue. And I think it speaks well to the future, I think, of the Canadian sector, that there's so much that there's a good thought being given to some of these very difficult issues. So I'd be curious to see what thoughts have been spurred further for the two of you.
I was just remembering when Colin talked about disruption. I used to work in the field. I actually used to lead up the fundraising department for a small institution here in Toronto. And I remember the disruption that direct mail caused. This was many, many years ago. And the seminars and the learning and the capacity building that went into getting the right direct mail ask with the right insert. I'm forgetting all of that. How do you develop donor lists? And that lasted for a good 20 years before it was disrupted by this, what we are talking about. Who sends direct mail anymore? We're all communicating like this. So it is an inevitability. It is entirely true that this artificial intelligence will play a leading role in helping organizations generate funds and support for their organizations. As long as we are able to address these foundational problems of ethics, ownership, data proprietorship, in a way that is not vertical or but in a way that is both vertical and horizontal, with government playing an appropriate role. I'm not one of those who wants to see government legislate every action. No, no, thank you. I think sometimes government needs to stay out of the way, but sometimes government needs to step in and say this and not this. And I don't know where that horizon is, but I do know that that conversation in Canada must start soon.
Couldn't agree more. And I think the other element that has to be managed properly is improving our privacy and data
Yeah.
regulation legislation. Sadly, in Canada, our updated legislation is stalled in the House of Commons, and we haven't even seen it get close to the Senate. That's worrisome because a lot of the questions that we're talking about are answered in that, giving individuals control over their data. There's a lot of there's difference between ownership and control. And legally, ownership of data is more challenging to manage than control. And so that's why Australia, for example, put in place a Consumer Data Rights Act, giving individuals the right to control their data and putting the onus and responsibility on organizations to provide individuals with data portability, the ability to move their data from one organization to another. And what's remarkable is how much insight can be gathered over time from those data if you have control over them, in terms of proving your trustworthiness, your creditworthiness on data that is very different than what is analyzed right now today. So there is a very explicit role for government in putting in place that legislative foundation. And I think to one of the recommendations in the report that Senator Omar led is that government needs to look at the charitable sector quite differently. I believe the charitable sector has an important role to help government prototype really, really neat ideas for future legislative and regulatory and program changes. And that we can constantly be getting an idea of what is the ROI on a certain way of addressing a societal challenge, and what's the most efficient and most effective approach to dealing with that. So the charitable sector, I think, has got to be treated somewhat differently, and it shouldn't be operating solely outside of government, but the framework to help us succeed in the move of AI into the charitable sector very much has to exist on the guardrails and standards, the legislative guard and regulatory guardrails and the standards that government puts in place, predominantly around the use of data.
I think that's one. So one of the things about the new business models that seem to be taking over so many industries is that scale is so important, that the scale has great advantages. And I think giving individuals portability is one sense. But do you worry about the concentration of, as we're seeing, donations go down, there seems to be a concentration. The largest charities seem to absorb more donations. The largest foundations seem to be even more important. The largest donors seem to be even more consequential because they have more resources, and that seems to be a pattern across many domains. Is this concentration and the importance of being very large if you're one of the big Silicon Valley companies? How do you address some of those issues in terms of concentration and scale that seem to be so important with the new technology?
Well, I actually think if given certain conditions, artificial intelligence could actually democratize philanthropy. It could make it accessible for me, you, and my neighbor across the street, as opposed to simply being, the castle that is occupied at a certain level only by wealthy people, foundations, philanthropists who tend to give. We know this from data that Canadians are generous. Most donors are older, also understandable. Most older donors will give to old institutions, also understandable. So already there is inequity. But think if the sector starts to think of artificial intelligence as the lever to to make philanthropy, generosity, compassion, whatever you may call it, whatever your motivations are, accessible to an ordinary person for a donation of $10 or whatever it is, then I think then we may see some of the ground shift. Frankly, I don't see Canada's big wealthiest philanthropists switching over to their giving to artificial intelligence. They're used to too much hand holding. They're used to too much, hand holding is a good word, and smothering with affection. And, as a former fundraiser, I understand that completely, completely. And that will always be. But for the others, for the rest, I'm actually quite excited by the potential that artificial intelligence could unleash. Imagine, that young people are being reached through their Instagram accounts. That's possible. A equals B. You like this, therefore you like that, therefore you like that. See, that's the way artificial intelligence, I think, works. I'm really not an expert in this, but I use Amazon, and I understand that Amazon understands me. So, if you can make those links, then it is not just disruption, but positive disruption. So I think there's great potential if it's done right.
And I'm going to build just another aspect of the issue from Senator Omidyar, and I'm going to talk about competition law. Because right now, Canadians tend to be at the wrong end of a data vacuum. We use US-based social media. We use US-based systems in terms of Amazon and others, where the majority of our data is leaving the country and being used by others, and we do not have control over it at this stage. And so there has been a winner-take-all approach in terms of how the playing field has been set up around big tech and the use of tech. And I think that competition law needs to catch up to that reality and make sure that there is plenty of room for new entrants in every field. And I think that needs to be true in the charitable sector as well. And so for me, it's a matter of government really looking at this disruption and saying what is healthiest for innovation in our society and competition on an ongoing basis, because innovation is central. Good competition law is central to allowing innovation. Organizations that do not have competitors stagnate. So it's it brings in that new perspective. The competition law and a leveling of the playing field brings in that new perspective. But what also happens is that you've got the ability for the incumbents to have to challenge themselves more on a daily basis. So you've got all the ideas and energy of the new entrants, which is always fantastic. But you've also got competitors saying, or the big incumbents, I can't just rest on my laurels. I can't just count on this donor being here as they always have been. And I can't just smother them the way I always smothered them, because they're expecting something a little different. So for me, competition is a really important part of any healthy sector. And I think we really need to look at how competition law is applied within the charitable sector as well, to enable new entrants and incumbents to both thrive.
I think that's a really
Interesting.
Yeah. So let me just ask about that, because both innovation and competition increasingly, as you mentioned, Senator Deakin, happening in international context, and data flows seem to be flowing, across borders in ways that are probably problematic. To what extent do you think, charity regulation, charity collaboration across borders is important for the future of AI in this context?
For me, I think it's going back to initial comment when we started this conversation, when we need to worry about the data streams that we're harnessing and whether or not they reflect the diversity that will allow us to make the best decisions. So whatever we can do to make the best decisions, respecting individuals' need to control their own data and have data portability. To me, data portability is becoming a global standard that will facilitate global cooperation and competition. Because if we have that interoperability between Canada and the United States as it relates to the flow of data. It means that data that goes to a US organization can also come home when I ask for it to do so. And so that's it, that's the opportunity that I think we really need to pursue. And I think that's becoming a de facto standard, but it's not yet a standard in legislation in Canada, and it needs to come.
So I actually don't think that we will ever get to a place where we legislate globally on these matters. I think that is too complex. Instead, in this case, since we're talking about philanthropy, and I'm going to focus on philanthropy, I don't know the bigger world of privacy and data protection as much as my esteemed colleague does. I think there will be a movement on civil society multilateralism, where the big associations, and there are charitable, there are associations of charities in the UK, the US, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, in sort of these kinds of common law jurisdictions. We have these associations, and I think it may well be up to them to start talking about the flow of information, its ownership, possibly its ethics, because again, even as I put these jurisdictions on the table, I realize that there is, where's the global south in this? Where's Africa in this? How do we feature in artificial intelligence, philanthropy, and the need for resources in international development? So, I'm thinking the sector will have to lead the way. It would be, I think, a lost opportunity if they vacated that space and then allowed government to step in, because that, we know, always has problems and issues. It's better for the people to lead first.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons that this conference is so important, and I salute Fundmetric and Acadia for putting this together, because to your point, Senator Omidvar, Amazon creates a very high standard for how people expect to receive kind of the ease of which they need to interact with the digital world. But it does seem that the very large social media platforms are already global and so powerful that it will require some kind of a vigorous convening to find an alternative to create some of this data portability and create kind of civic priority first, rather than kind of absorbing as much data for your own self. Some of the commercial folks, I'm sure the Senator Deacon knows, talk about data as the new oil, right? So there's kind of a very acquisitive logic out there, people trying to acquire as much data for themselves. And we see a different data regime, of course, in other countries like China, for example, right? So these are significant challenges for our public representatives like yourselves.
No, absolutely, but there is a move towards global standards in GDPR, the European standard that now has got a lot of testing. Canada has to work to become GDPR compliant if Canadian businesses want to work in Europe. The same is true for the United States. Australia and the European Union, I think, have been leading a lot in this area, and it is helping to create this potential for interoperability, where everybody isn't necessarily doing the same legislative standard, but they are rising to the same expectation and standard in terms of behavior. But I'll offer one thing that I was provided by a tremendous leader in Australia, who is Scott Farrell, who's designed much of their work around open banking and their consumer data right. Is he described data as the new uranium, because it's very powerful, but it's also, if mishandled, very dangerous. And it can be an existential danger for an organization if they allow a data breach, that they lose the trust of their constituents. And that certainly can be true. Organizations have way more data than they realize, way more personal information than they realize on their constituents. And so understanding how to make sure that you are catching up to that new standard about how you need to manage your own data, and are you protected from the sort of cybersecurity risk that we saw on the U.S. East Coast in the last little while is really an increasing concern. So I think that looking at data as the new uranium, I think it really helps to understand that that we've got that carrot, but we've also got a bit of a stick coming up behind us increasingly.
I think that's a great metaphor. That's a terrific metaphor. The new uranium. We have some questions coming in, so if I will pose these questions to you, senators. First one is from John Treleaven from Mercy Ships. He asks, tax leverage charitable activity is inhibited by all the factors identified in the Senate report. Most of these inhibitors are related to government control issues. How does AI threaten control of the sector by governments?
Absolutely right. The levers of change right now, as far as charities are concerned, all lie within regulation and legislation. So artificial intelligence can be a disruptor in many ways, and I'm blue skying here. If used successfully, it could actually free the sector from its ongoing, overwhelming reliance on government. It is huge. All the data in Canada tells you that the charitable dollar is a minuscule percentage of an organization's budget. Most of the money for public good, and maybe that's right. You know, we can have a philosophical discussion about whether the public good should be financed by the charitable dollar, which is flirtatious, you know, at best. Today it's bees, tomorrow it's birds, who knows? Or by the taxpayer. You know, that's a different conversation. Would love to have that one day. But I think artificial intelligence may have that possibility, not right now, but 10 years from now, if it really is embraced by the sector, to displace some of the dominance that the government exercises over it, just in terms of the purse strings. So I think that's certainly one factor that could play into it. The second factor that could play into it is if the sector embraces artificial intelligence, it will be infused by young people. You know, it will be infused by young people. Young people know how to do this. I'm a complete techno twit, as Colin well knows. I can barely get the Zoom on in the morning. And so that infusion of young people in the sector will give it greater voice. It will give it greater political heft. And perhaps the government will start paying more attention to it. Governments are susceptible to movements of people who they want to vote for them. And if there's a movement of people towards the charitable sector, towards, let's say, justice, the will of the government will bend to the will of the people. So that's really blue skying it out in a big way. I hope that answers your question.
I think that's a wonderful response. Senator Deakin.
I have nothing to add. That was...
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a really interesting blue sky version of the future, because in the United States, you know, we some people say we're always stuck at 2% of GDP, philanthropy accounting for GDP. And then the more Pollyanna's view is that, you know, we've managed to keep philanthropy at 2% of GDP as our GDP has grown. And of course, philanthropy trails government support and fees for service as the main sources of revenue for the nonprofit sector as well. And we're always wondering how might that mix change in the future. We have another question from Alan McKinley Tilgner of the Ottawa Food Bank. He asks, with AI and digitization growing exponentially, how can we rely on the government, which moves slowly, to help the charities protect our donors' privacy and data? What else can we do?
That's a question for Colin.
Yeah. I would offer that it's voluntary standards. Work with organizations that help you do that to a global standard, because they exist. So how the software you purchase, the standards you practice in your organization, the platforms you work on, make sure they are operating to the highest global standards, because those organizations do exist. And both Senator Obenvar and I are new to the parliamentary process. She's, I think, 6 years or 7 years now in the Senate.
No.
No,
Five.
5. There,
Mhm.
and I'm just coming up on 3 years, and the pace is challengingly slow on every level, on everything that we attempt to do. Um, you're seeing things move quite rapidly in the United States right now. I'm envious on a lot of levels. I'm seeing things move really rapidly in Australia. I'm incredibly envious on a lot of levels. The UK is iterating on their iterations in terms of very key areas of data control. There are global organizations are keeping up to those standards on a lot of levels. So for me, that's the best way to deal with it at this point in time. Government regulation and the regulations that will come in when we update our privacy legislation and the regulations that will enable that legislation to actually where the rubber hits the road are still quite a ways away in Canada, sadly. And that's troubling from my standpoint, because I see this not as just a foundation for social protections as the world increasingly digitizes, but its economic prosperity is totally reliant on our having really good privacy legislation. So it there are ways to work around through those organizations that are adopting the highest standards.
I think that's very wise because we have seen, and I think throughout history, what happens when a small number or a singular entity captures the advantages of scale, and then other people don't get an opportunity to innovate. And one of the areas that I think shows us a sense of the possibilities is something that we take for granted, something that is also based on a voluntary group coming together and creating mutual standards, and that's something called Wikipedia. You know, that is still it reminds me of what we thought the internet might have become before it became one large
Winner take
kind of
all.
winner take all play. So as we're coming to the end of our session, maybe both of you could share something that makes you optimistic, or what you really want the participants to take away from this initial session.
So I like the idea of a voluntary code. So you just triggered something. How do we manage this new brave new world? We definitely need to look at the horizon, but we also need to look at the guardrails on each side, and maybe the sector on its own coming together with the help of academic research and some legal advice to put in place a voluntary code of ethics that it could rely on in its use of artificial intelligence. Now, we have a very highly regarded sector organization called Imagine Canada, which should likely take the lead, along with the United Ways of Canada, the Community Foundations of Canada, and others. So then, that's the beginning of the conversation, and I'm hoping if the sector leads, there may be a time when the sector will need to interact with government and say we do need legislation A or legislation B. But let's not start with legislation. Let's start with the people coming together and developing that voluntary code. I really like that idea, Colin. Thank you for giving us that.
Well, and I think what you've hit on is really a new trend on what's happening around regulatory development. Is that regulators are increasingly looking to standards development bodies. And in Canada, the first group that has put in place standards has been an independent standards development body called the CIO Strategy Council. And that's a Standards Council of Canada or ISO accredited standards body. And so there is already work being done that we can lever. And then we can say to different platforms, and we can say to colleagues more broadly, we expect this standard to be robustly adhered to, and look to organizations to demonstrate that when they, that's where a certification that is developed by a global group in Canada, potentially, and in the United States, a certification can very much help to make sure that everybody is all the sort of most credible organizations are adhering to a minimum standard that we feel is protecting the consumers and donors and other constituents. So to me, that's a fast and easy way, because you're not waiting on government. And what it also allows government to do, and I think what's being increasingly recognized by regulators, is it allows them to prototype legislation and regulations and to really focus where they need to be involved, and it allows for something to be much more nimble and adjust to realities of the marketplace, which, the challenge with regulatory burden is that quite often it's developed by what regulators see, not by what is the actual experience in the field. And you can get to the same end that the regulator may want to achieve in terms of an outcome much more efficiently when you've got experience in the field. And so I'm a real believer in the fact that there is that ability to develop and adhere to standards, and then get a group that adheres to it and start to get a certification that is voluntary. Very, very helpful and cost efficient. And you get what you're asking for versus get what you're given by government, which 9 times out of 10 is a better outcome.
That's great. Well, I'm thrilled that there's this wonderful insight that we arrived on in this introductory session. And to this, I will just add my appreciation for the young people who are part of the university, who have put this conference together and who are so enthusiastic about what we might call data for good, and the sense of trying to figure out how their digitally native understanding of our world and how that can better be used to inform our civic space, and improve our civic outcomes. So that's my hope for my hopeful note is that I have seen so many young people who are so digitally masterful of turning their attention to what we would call data for good, and seeding training programs that can hopefully through universities also feed into what we hope will be this voluntary standards creation board that can kind of empower and connect the wonderful work that our nonprofit and civic society does in Canada and much more broadly. So
I will thank you,
sure.
Dean Pasek, for your leading us in this conversation, and to Acadia and Fundmetric, 2 tremendous Nova Scotian-based organizations. As an independent senator from Nova Scotia, I'm very proud of that, and I'm grateful to Senator Omidyvar for taking the time to be part of this and bringing her experience to this conversation.
And my thanks to you too, Dean Pasek. A really interesting kind of fireside chat. This is the best way to have conversations, and to Acadia University for hosting it and inviting me to take part in this.
Thank you all, and we look forward to the rest of the conference. May it go well. Thank you.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.